Good evening, everybody. My name is Matthew Kilcoyne. Welcome to the second webinar of the Adam Smith Institute series on COVID. We are looking at tonight whether the socialists claim that this crisis means the end for liberalism, for libertarianism, and what the governments around the world are doing that actually suggests maybe the opposite. And what social norms, rules, and regulations are being challenged during this crisis. We're still waiting on one of our participants to join us. He's based in Eastern Australia, so it's very early in the morning for him, and I'm slightly worried that his alarm clock hasn't gone off. But if he joins us, we will go to Stephen. I'm also joined, very, very happy to say, by Shoshana Weissman of the R Street Institute from Washington, D.C. this afternoon, and Madeline Grant, who joins us from London. I will tell you a little bit about them, and then we can start. We'll go to Shoshana first, and then we'll go to Madeline for their takes. So Shoshana Weissman is the senior manager. She deals with digital media at the R Street Institute. She also works as a fellow on occupational licensing reform and other issues. She's written for various publications, including the Wall Street Journal and USA Today. Madeline Grant will be familiar to many of you in the UK. She's an assistant comment editor at the Daily Telegraph, and she used to be the editorial manager at the think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, one of our favorite fellow think tanks in the United Kingdom. Thank you both very much for joining us. Shoshana, a lot of your work has come under the spotlight in recent months, and I was hoping that you would tell us a little bit more about occupational licensing, what it means, and what's happening in the USA and around the world on that issue. And I'll just put you on spotlight.
Sure. No, thanks so much for having me. It's been a weird time. I've been really lucky that I'm still employed and I haven't had to worry about that. And my parents are doing fine too. But it's been kind of wild to see everything happen. I mean, I know it's kind of surreal for everyone, but it's a really weird time. And I actually expected all my work to be on the back burner during this time. I figured, during a real public health crisis like this, they're going to need just health and medical experts. But within a week of around the time the United States started to shut everything down, occupational licensing reform was the first thing they did. Now, in the United States, and I know it differs in every US state and around the world, but the landscape where I am is basically each state has its own licensing, and that includes for nurses, doctors, pharmacists, professions like that. And in order to work across state lines, that's just not a thing you can do. You have to be licensed in multiple states. You have to, your license doesn't transfer across state lines. Nurses are also heavily limited in what they're allowed to do. Basically, they're just not allowed to practice to the full extent of their training. They can't treat patients on their own. They can't prescribe even basic medication in a lot of cases, which is frustrating that it all has to be done under a doctor. A lot of those regulations in states have just gone away. Now, with the inability to work across state lines, that's a little bit more, basically it's because of the way the laws are outlined that you have to be licensed in the state to practice in the state. And it's silly because it's just a matter of geography. But over the past couple of weeks, states have waived everything, saying, hey, you can work across state lines, go where you're needed over telehealth, do what you need. Doctors are being welcomed across state lines, and immigrants who are doctors. It's a wild process to become relicensed as an immigrant doctor in the United States. Now they've made that process like nothing. They just told doctors, go help out, go work in at least 2 states in the US, which is wild. For reference, this is stuff that would have been unimaginable a month or 2 ago. I've been floored by this. A lot of my work focuses on saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't need a license to arrange flowers, which is a real thing in one US state. Other states license fortune tellers or people who braid hair or blow dry hair. And I tend to focus a lot on that to show people it's ridiculous that you need thousands of hours of training to do these things. It's silly. But with medical licensing, that's when you start getting people saying, oh, you libertarians don't want doctors to have licenses. And of course I want a doctor to have a license, but I also want to make sure that the regulations in place are protecting people, not protecting the industry, as is so often the case. That's also why you'll see fights between cosmetologists and government trying to de-license parts of cosmetology. And it's why you'll see like the American Medical Association, which represents doctors, and American Nurse Associations fighting all the time because doctors don't want nurses to be able to practice more in a lot of cases. So you've seen those regulations go away. There's also tons of others that have disappeared. I'm not sure where certificate of need laws exist in other countries, but in the US, you need government permission to add hospital beds in certain states or to add new medical technologies. And those aptly named CON laws, certificate of need CON, have been waived like nothing. And with all of this work, these are things that my colleagues and I have been working on for years, some of them before I was born. And it's been such an uphill battle to get these reforms passed. And so many of them really do relate to health and safety. I mean, getting rid of them relates to health and safety. And it's been such an uphill battle, but over the past couple of weeks, it's just disappeared overnight. And it'll be back. These are executive orders that are temporary in most cases. I'm hoping that some will become permanent, but as someone who's worked on this for a couple of years and who knows people who's worked on this for decades, it's an unbelievable change nearly overnight.
Thank you very much, Shoshana. That's great. I'm going to head over. I'm just going to give you a quick couple of housekeeping things. Usually at this stage in proceedings, if I was at the institute, I would have to point out the fire exits and so on. So I would just say, check out the fire exits on your own home. But more importantly, we actually have a Q&A ongoing as well. In the bottom of your screen is a little button saying Q&A. You should be able to click that. You'll be able to send us. We've already got one come in from Connor Boyle. We will be answering questions after Madeline has spoken, after I've given a quick update as well on what's happening here in the UK. And so please do send those in. We've also got a couple of hands up from attendees, including James Gorgeous Hunk Price. So please name yourself as well. Make it as fun and as you like. I'm going to go straight over to Madeline now, who has been keeping an eye on some of the more heavy-handed actions of authorities here in the UK, and she's going to tell us a little bit about sort of the social norms of individuals and just how easily we've adapted or not adapted to institutions here, changing what it is that they do on a daily basis. Over to you, Madeline.
Thank you, Matt. I think that's actually what is, in some ways, almost as alarming of the massive wholesale change to the way that we live, has been the way in which we've so quickly come to view the world in a different way. I was watching just some TV on Netflix the other day, might have been Friends or something, where they all pile into a cafe. And my gut instinct was, why are they in a group? Oh my God, why are they hugging each other? Why are they not obeying social distancing rules? And I realized that it's been about 3 weeks and I've already adapted to the new circumstances. But my concern is that we forget that these things should be temporary. We get far too used to the new circumstances, which after all is not the normal, and it should never be the normal. And we also need to be, I think we need to be questioning as much as possible the grand changes that are coming in. Not saying that we should resist them, of course not, but we should, I think, be making sure that what the government is implementing, which is putting great limitations on our day-to-day life, is not exceeding the necessity of the restrictions that have to be made to deal with this massive virus. I very much enjoyed listening to what Shoshana had to say about the regulations. And I think that's actually, it's useful for us as libertarians now to think about how we can try to win these arguments when we come out of the other side, because you can be damn sure that our opponents will be doing exactly the same thing. In fact, they're doing it all the time in every possible way. And I think the point about the regulations is a very good retort when left-wingers look at the way in which the government is financing these programs to help the unemployed, which is a crisis situation and it's, again, meant to be temporary. They say things like, well, this proves that the magic money tree was there all along, we just needed to shake it. And I think we can retort by saying, well, this proves just how many pointless deadweight regulations were on the statute book for so long, and just how quickly they can be removed and how beneficially they can be removed with how well it can work for business and society. But yeah, the general consensus is that liberalism has taken a whacking because of coronavirus, that free trade, globalisation out, that localism is in, and also an assumption that as we kind of accept a command economy in the short run, that this vindicates a kind of left-wing worldview in the long run. And some are even arguing that this level of state intervention should become the norm, in the same way that after World War II, the command economy mentality persisted for decades, rationing continued until into the mid-1950s. And of course, the National Health Service was born, and the kind of collectivist mentality that continues to surround healthcare in this country. It's very depressing for me as a libertarian, but I'm increasingly coming to the view that we will have to accept big constraints on our liberty in the short term, greater surveillance, tracing and tracking of coronavirus patients in the general population in order to determine who is immune and who can be reintegrated into society, and even consider things like immunity certificates when you've passed the antibody test that shows that you can re-enter the workforce. Now that makes me really uncomfortable, the idea of kind of de facto identity cards being used in that way. But I also suspect that in terms of long-term freedom, it might be better to go down that route in the short term, make damn sure that everything has a firm sunset clause so it doesn't last into the long term. But I think that would be preferable to a kind of otherwise the alternative, which is a kind of indefinite shutdown of the economy and all the catastrophic implications for not just the economy in the short term, but future taxpayers and future generations who will have to pick up the tab for this. But this is the kind of the weird irony of coronavirus, in a way, that the disease that began in China and was allowed to spread unchecked for months because of the repression and the misinformation of a communist regime will in some ways involve us behaving a bit more like China in the short term in order to regain our economic freedom. But I also don't think that there is no cause for hope. As Matt mentioned, with the work I've been doing, I feel like I don't know enough to comment on the validity of the lockdown, because I don't think I understand the modelling well enough. I don't have that knowledge. But I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been completely alarmed by some of the more egregious examples of police overreach in the last few weeks. And I'm pretty sure that for people having their time in the park monitored by police, and of course the COVID Stasi, the twitchy neighbours who are just looking for an opportunity to blab to the authorities for their neighbour taking the second run of the day. There's even examples of people having their shopping baskets monitored by overzealous council officials who try to determine to declare Easter eggs to be non-essential items. I'm pretty sure that this absolute madness that we're living through will create a few new libertarians at the same time that many people are just accepting it quite quietly and happily. And the other big area where I think may prompt a conversation is in healthcare in this country. I mean, Matt Lesh, of Matt's colleague, has written an absolutely brilliant report looking into the failure of testing in this country, and it shows that Public Health England, the quango that was overseeing all of this, was reluctant to engage with the private sector and turned down opportunities from engineering labs who were desperate to help the effort. And I think that after this is over, people will start to question whether that kind of collectivist mentality is really the best thing, especially when you look at how well, for example, supermarkets have responded to the difficulty. There are, benefits to having things run in a more localized way, to have a system that's more adaptive to local pressure, and also the failure to deliver protective equipment to every hospital that needed it, I think is also an example that, it's difficult to run so much from a kind of top-down command chain, that you want to have a more flexible system and a more adaptive one. So yeah, those are my initial thoughts. I feel that it's a tricky time for liberalism and for libertarians generally, but also there is an awful lot that's vindicating the private sector in this war, and it's just up to us to make those arguments and not concede too much intellectual ground.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Mads. Now I'll take the floor for the UK in terms of the type of laws that we've seen suspended here, but also some of the instructions. So a lot of the sort of initial claim about the tack on like libertarianism, liberalism is at an end, came from the level of state involvement in the economy. And this was what Stephen was going to talk about. And if he joins us later, I hope he'll be able to do so as well. But basically, actually, a lot of what we've been calling for years and years and years is objective-based, evidence-based policy making. And a lot of what the sort of the socialist left usually calls for is ideological based policymaking. The argument that the reason why we're supporting various measures of supporting companies that would otherwise go bust, making sure that people are able to keep their jobs, is because it does all of the things that we usually say shouldn't happen in an economy. So it keeps unprofitable companies going that would otherwise fail and have creative destruction. It keeps people in jobs where actually they would be better in a more fulfilled in other roles. It actually makes sure that people are not having to go looking for work, that they're able to stay at home, that they're able to keep socially distanced, that they're able to ensure that their family members are kept safe, and that we're keeping deaths and hospitalizations to a minimum. And actually that kind of reaction by governments, not just in the UK, not just in the US, but across, and various US states, but across the Western world, has been mostly to the good. It's been very positive to see. And a lot of what we've also seen in the UK is suspension of various laws to enable that goal relatively quickly, and made by people who are traditionally instinctively of the right. So we are seeing, especially in our own government, various law suspensions that could be made permanent, but also some that shouldn't be made permanent. And we have to be very careful about supporting all those laws and forever being suspended. And we have to be and we have to see which ones work, which ones don't, which ones are right for right now, and which ones are for the long run. There are various things like pubs, restaurants, takeaways being able to deliver food without having to apply to their local council to get a license, for example, which seems like it could probably come in and stay in, so long as it, that they're not causing people to get ill as they eat the food. And that seems like a very sensible one. Ones where, for example, the suspension of insolvency law, like wrongful trading during insolvency proceedings, where you are trading without care, recklessly. You might want that now, because otherwise various firms would be shuttering forever, even though they know that actually there's a government grant likely to arrive, a government crisis loan likely to arrive in a month or 2 months' time. They would be forced to shut now. You do not want that in the long run, because in the long run that creates perverse incentive for companies to run. You do, however, want large-scale companies to be able to access grants. You don't just want that to be for those companies that are performing badly right now. You want that for as many companies as possible. You want it to be broad brush. You don't want to be providing a positive addition to the balance sheets of just companies that were likely to fail anyway, whilst punishing companies that have acted prudently during the good times as well. Now, from my point of view, also, I look at trade on a regular basis. Free trade for me has continued to save lives where we've been able to keep trade free. The worst actions have been taken by those countries who have tried to be protectionist in their trade. We've seen export bans at the EU level. We've seen export bans introduced on protective equipment, personal equipment from Germany. We've also seen President Donald Trump try and introduce exactly the same export ban from the United States. And that's the problem with export bans and with trade protectionism in general, is that you end up sickening thy neighbor. You end up increasing the barriers to trade in a tit-for-tat way between states. And actually, the UK has done a relatively good job, as Truss has done a relatively good job at the World Trade Organization, of saying that no, tariffs should be kept low or cut, that we need trade to be flowing as much as possible, that actually varied sources of imports and inputs are going to save lives over the long run, especially food, if we're going to see this labor shortages in southern European states continue into the summer, or Eastern European states, or even in the UK as well. We're going to need to ensure that we've got imports coming from right around the world in the freest way possible. But also just things like, we've also seen, various different ways in which states have been able to act depending on the level to which they're centralized or decentralized. In the UK and in the United States, when they were looking at testing, Madeline mentioned earlier Matthew Leish's paper from last week looking at testing. The UK tried to centralize. It tried to have a single place doing the testing, and that has held back our ability to ramp up capacity. In the United States, that was their original tack, the CDC and the FDA. The CDC tried to ensure that there was only one place that could do testing. It was their labs. They broke that down and actually said private labs, charity labs, university labs, big, small, private, public, charity, no matter what, every single one, get involved. This is a fight for human survival that has to be tackled by everybody, and everyone can play their part. That happened as well in South Korea. In Germany already, they had that decentralization that allowed that kind of take up. But it's also important at the sort of business level. The grant system here in the UK for crisis loans has been slow and cumbersome because of the fact that we have a very heavily centralized system that just doesn't understand the economy underlying it, because it's too broad brush, too heavy at a national level. In Switzerland, that's not true. They've had a very streamlined process. They are saying we'll give you the money now and we'll do the checks later. And that they have a very, very good network of canton level states, but also cantons are the sort of state level in Switzerland. And they have good levels with sort of business and chambers of commerce that can verify these companies and ensure very, very, very quick transmission of funds, which means that those companies in Switzerland are in a much better financial position right now than others. And so there's a measure to which actually streamlining government, making sure that it's acting at the right level, but also getting rid of pointless laws has been a key part of dealing with this crisis. So actually, from my point of view, it's not the end of liberalism. It's much more a way of us saying, what is the state for? How should it react to this kind of crisis? And I think that's a good challenge for us. It's perfect actually for someone like myself starting a career in think tankery, to sit there and say and like have a challenge like this for the next decade that meets the needs of not just our own nation but also a global community of businesses and individuals. Now we've got a bunch of questions that have come in. I'm going to unmute Shoshana and Madeline, and I'm going to stick us back into gallery view so you can see all of our shiny faces and Shoshana's amazing background, which is so utterly on brand. In fact, someone, Matthew Lesh on Twitter, was saying that all of our backgrounds match our personalities, which I'm slightly worried that he thinks that my background is a spiky cactus.
Plain, so clearly I don't have a personality.
Shall we jump in? Madeline, just for Madeline and Shoshana's benefit, if you click the Q&A section at the bottom, all of the questions should pop up.
Okay.
Madeline, I'm going to give the first question to you. You can pick which one you want to go on to.
Oh, sorry, me?
Yes, you. Yeah.
Oh,
you can pick.
Sure. That's interesting. I like this question about education. It's not that the second question that I can see from Tom Burrows. It's not something that I've considered at all.
Do you want to read the question? People can't read them.
Yeah, let me read it. How will the move to home-based learning change potential views about education? Might it encourage people to think whether the existing school system is fit for purpose? Now, that's an interesting one because in this country, we don't have the same kind of tradition of homeschooling that you have in the States. And I know personally, my friends that have kids are pulling their hair out and going completely spare because of the attempts to homeschool. That was the consensus about a week ago when I last chatted to my friend who has a kid. And a week on from that, and I think some people are beginning to get into the swing of things. They figured out the technology and they're finding the benefits of that kind of learning. And not just using the materials that they've been given from school, but they're doing all sorts of different things with their kids, teaching them stuff that's not on the syllabus and generally enjoying themselves. I think that the question for education in this country, we have our private school system that is kind of, it's sort of a British institution that goes way back. And you question private schools. Obviously there's a tranche of angry left-wingers who hate them on the whole, and the kind of Corbynista left. But mostly that's just a fact of life that exists. We don't really question it. I do wonder whether, especially given the hardship that private schools themselves will be going through as a result of the coronavirus, it's not yet clear what, if any, government help they'll be getting. There are many parents who will be refusing to pay their school fees and so on. It might be that there are fewer private schools as a result, and people do actually start to think, now I've successfully taught my kids for however long this lockdown goes on for. Are there some benefits to continuing that approach, especially because just as there are some schools that won't be operating, there may in the short term be people who don't have jobs and also there'll be people who are working very differently and more likely to be doing things at home. So you might have whole families living at home and able to order their schedules around teaching their kids and also doing their work at the same time.
I think my brother's a teacher, so I will admit an interest in this topic. He's had to move on to, because he's also sort of he's got he had pneumonia last year, so he's in the at-risk bracket, and at home very much. The move that we've seen from his school is sort of like online teaching videos, some of which I would profess, well, I think is kind of like showing the teachers are doing something to the parents, rather than using resources that are already online and, you know, global and so on. They're specific to their school, and some of it's the sort of like, look, we are open and doing things, and that might be actually part of it, is like some of the individuation that Madeline, like you'll have seen at sort of at university at Oxford, you know, the small seminar, that one-to-one, likely, I think personally, likely to continue for quite some time. But those big seminars that I used to have at York with sort of 30 people in a room, where you weren't really answering questions, you weren't really having a discussion, which could have been done online via Zoom, perhaps. Where maybe their days are a bit more numbered now. The kind of school, I think education was under quite a lot of pressure anyway prior to this, especially at the sort of university level, where we've started to see the sheer numbers of people going into at university to saturate the value of a degree to a certain extent in certain professions, and we've seen different funding models coming in from places like Lambda School in the United States, where they take an equity stake in your future income rather than a fee up front, so that there's an incentive for them to provide good quality education, even if it's a distance learning, and to get you a job, and a high paying job as well. That's very much in their interest. And I think maybe we'll start to see a bit more, now that people are at home anyway, a bit more of a push towards that kind of high quality, high outcome education. I'm going to quick one because I just saw it came in from my boss, and I think I should always answer the questions that come in from the boss. Eamon Butler asks, shouldn't we have an official review of regulations so we can identify the ones most thwarted firms' responses to the crisis, like labeling, packaging laws, preventing wholesalers selling direct to the public, or similar? In the UK, actually, we've been pretty good. Lots of wholesalers have started selling absolutely directly to the public. The Robert Jenrick, the Minister of Housing, Communities, Local Government, as well as Alex Sharma in business, moved lots and lots of regulations out of the way to allow that. They also suspended lots of regulation on protective personal equipment, so that you didn't need to have got yourself registered with the European Union, safety protection schemes, but so long as you were producing quality goods, then you were able to supply directly into the NHS. And in fact, we've also seen places like schools, anywhere with a 3D printer, able to do that. Ineos, Brewdog, the beer firm, have started making hand sanitizer as well. So some pretty good regulations being swept out of the way there, I think. But Shoshana, what's happening in the US?
Oh yeah, you know, I'm actually gonna pivot to Daniel Rickford, who had a really similar question, like what pieces of deregulation in the USA would you like to remain in place after the pandemic? You know, what should be lifted, which ones should not be reinstated? So along the exact same lines, it's really interesting because there's some regulations that are being lifted that should be temporary. Like there's a lot of cities are lifting parking regulations so people don't have to go outside and move their cars, which makes sense, except for Albany, New York, which as of like 2 weeks ago was still ticketing people, which is ridiculous. But for the interim, it makes sense to suspend those, but not for the long term. But getting rid, I mean, basically enabling doctors to work across state lines, everyone to work across state lines. There's no reason for that not to be the case already. Expanding nurse scope of practice, getting rid of con laws. Those are so ridiculous. We need them to end really badly. And there's so many too. And like you were saying, there should be a regulatory review, but part of the problem, and I'm not sure if it's the case in the UK, but in the US, any state that has a regulatory sunset review sometimes they go great, but a lot of times people are like, oh, we'll just renew it. And it kind of becomes an automatic renewal. And there's different models on how to do it better. I know that it's just, it really has to be done super carefully to make sure it works. And it's a model I like. It's just one that a lot of times, if you don't have the right people in office, they're just gonna kind of YOLO it and do whatever. But there should definitely be more regulatory reviews. There's also, I mean, these licensing laws really need to end. And making sure that immigrant doctors can work is really important. I know that there's a lot of international law in this area that I'm not as well versed in, but basically you don't want to pull doctors from places in need and have them all come to the US. As much as we would like to have more doctors, we don't want it to hurt other people. But basically making sure that the process for relicensing here for those able to come here isn't ridiculous, because right now you have immigrant doctors competing for residencies with US graduates, and residencies are limited. So lots of immigrant doctors just can't become doctors because they can't get a residency, which is ridiculous. Part of that goes to the residency system in the US. It's just really, really restrictive, and we need to stop that, and we need to make more residencies so that we can have more doctors and not just medical school graduates who can't be doctors, which is also ridiculous. But there's so much room for reform that I think people are really starting to understand. There's also, I hadn't talked about this yet, but in the US, in a lot of localities, it's illegal to run a business out of your home. And some people might think, oh yeah, I don't want all that traffic on my street. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about uploading YouTube videos from your house alone. That was illegal, and it was cracked down on in one state. In another state, a woman was just doing her job from home, like sitting at home at her laptop, and the government said, no, you can't do that. And in other cases, it's even, it might be low traffic, like one car parked outside your house a couple of times a day max, really, really low traffic, things that aren't disrupting neighborhoods. That's all illegal. And it's really bad now because we want people to stay home, but we're punishing them for working from home. I don't think there's been enforcement of those, but it's always hard to know because there's so many localities with really similar things on the books. And then out in California with AB 5, which basically doesn't allow part-time freelance workers to classify themselves as such in many cases. A lot of people lost their jobs over the past couple of months because to comply, businesses were like, look, we can't hire out to you anymore. And a lot of those people were sitting at home working, helping out sick family. Maybe they themselves were sick and had autoimmune conditions or something like that, but working from home worked for them, and the schedule and the flexibility worked for them. When we took that away and then coronavirus hit, I mean, it was just, it really piled on these people. So, one thing that I think people forget a lot is that all regulations have costs. And it doesn't mean all regulations are bad, but you can't pretend like regulations are just like, the icing on a cake or sprinkles. They're like, they add calories to you, they weigh you down, just like normal sprinkles and frosting. But people act like it's a nicety, like it's a cute thing with no consequences that'll just help people, but regulations have real consequences. And if you don't take that into account, then you don't think about all the unintended or even obvious consequences. In a lot of these cases, these regulations were going to hurt people in a way that was predictable, but just expanding flexibility as much as possible. We've seen now, and during so many disasters, flexibility is so important, whether that's working in different places over telemedicine systems or working from home, whatever it is. I think we now has really shown people that you really need to expand flexibility as much as possible and not let some perfect that doesn't exist be the enemy of the good.
Yeah, I would also just very quickly, as you've mentioned, doctors being able to work across borders in the US. Actually, in the UK, that's one of the ones where we've really struggled. We actually have refugees here who have medical degrees from recognized universities, which are not on the blacklist for the Department of Health, because there is such a thing of like certain universities that you don't want people to have studied at. But like they are banned from working in the UK, and that they really should be. We also have Americans and Australians and Canadians and Kiwis who are trained in their countries, but who haven't done a year-long conversion courses they would usually have to do. And we haven't fast-tracked. Now, there is it looks like the Department of Health is looking at fast tracking, but it still hasn't fast tracked, and instead moved for bringing back retired doctors and nurses. Now,
yeah,
that's great. That's really great. But they typically are in the higher risk group category.
right.
And you're putting people at risk whilst doing that.
No, you're totally right. We've actually brought back retirees. That's one other change that's happened. Basically, every flexibility that can be added has been. With immigrant doctors, it's been limited here, but I'm hoping in both the US and the UK that they start to realize we can't stop, or we shouldn't stop these people from becoming doctors. It's silly.
Yes. So Matt, I was hoping Max Marlowe sent in a question saying, do you think this crisis is teaching us about fear more than bravery, the former breaking liberalism and the latter supporting it? I was wondering, considering we've seen sort of, Derbyshire police, drone footage, shaming people back into their homes, and, people, maybe not saying they're volunteering, but then actually not volunteering and so on. Are we perhaps being scared during this crisis more than we are facing up to the reality and taking it head on?
Well, it's hard to say which of those two instincts is winning, because it's partly the fault of the media, but also social media. They tend to give disproportionate attention to the mad examples just because that is more interesting. The story of the person who didn't dog on their neighbour is fundamentally less interesting than the tales of the hundreds and possibly thousands of people who've been inundating police forces with their informant stuff. And also the police forces themselves. There are police forces that have been sensible and proportionate and haven't been overreaching themselves, but some of the egregious examples are pretty bloody memorable, to be quite honest. You've got Derbyshire police dyeing a lake black in the hope that it would make it less of a beauty spot, and so walkers and day trippers would be less likely to visit it. It's sort of like something for the Benny Hill show, isn't it? It's sort of Hot Fuzz vibes. It's sort of incompetent comedy policing. In terms of fear, and I've seen an awful lot of bravery, but I do think that fear is not just allowing the authorities to sometimes exercise their muscle beyond what has been legally given to them by the government. But I also think it's preventing us from having a full conversation about the implications of what has been, possibly and probably, I think, the biggest power grab of central government since the Second World War. And it's happening very quickly at a time when, because of this virus, Parliament is not meeting, or if it is, it's meeting remotely. At the same time, the courts of justice are not sitting in the same way. There probably are some meetings still taking place, but a tiny proportion of them. So at the same time that the executive and the legislative functions of the economy of society have shut down, it's also difficult for, the amount of abuse I've had as a journalist, and I haven't even said that we shouldn't have the lockdown, but I've said, should the police be doing this? Let's make sure that we're discussing the economic implications of the lockdown as well as the short-term impact on health. And let's also look at, the well-being of individuals in the lockdown. Even drawing attention to these issues, you're accused of a kind of treachery, as if either you don't care about your grandma, you're happy for old people to die, or you're not committed to the national effort. And I think that collective attitude is kind of what Max was alluding to, that people are very frightened and they look around and they see neighbours who they think are somehow not adapting to the rules properly, and therefore that enables them to commit what I think is the ultimate crime of snitching. It sort of justifies that behaviour, but I just think it's still very important that we have the conversation about it properly, because nothing is so permanent as a temporary government programme, and there's a danger that if we're not giving it the proper scrutiny, that some of these things either can continue to go too far and possibly stay with us for a very long time.
Fair enough. James Heal, who I presume is James Heal of the Mail on Sunday, asks if we should continue the practice of shaming bad businesses into doing the right thing, in quotation marks, once the coronavirus crisis has passed. What do you reckon, guys?
Where's this question, sorry?
James Heal says, should we continue the practice of shaming bad businesses into doing the right thing once the crisis has passed?
I think this is exactly, I completely agree. This is exactly what we should be doing. This is what we've always said, those of us who are big fans of capitalism. We've always said that the free market will often deliver justice outcomes as well as just, greater gains for the seller of a good or a producer of a good, that social pressure plays a big part in it, and that the best way to, for example, if you a bad practice is going on within a business, that there is absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, it's a good thing when people draw attention to bad malpractice, because very often the concerned consumer will vote with their feet and not shop at these places again. And I actually think that for companies, the way they behave right now will have a huge impact on their long-term functioning. I think people will remember the people who were sort of goodies in this crisis, the people who took care of their workers, the firms who readapted their production to help with the national effort, to, the car manufacturers who are now making ventilators, the alcohol producers who are making hand gels and so on. I think people will remember this stuff. And in the same way, they will remember the businesses that didn't take good care of their employees, like I forget the name, I think Britannia Hotels sent out this absolutely callous letter to all of their employees saying, you're no longer needed, please, basically clear out by the end of the week. And that did the rounds on social media. And if you think about how powerful cancel culture is at the best of times in this country, people are going to apply that. And for once, we might actually get a bit of social justice out of the social justice warriors.
What do you think, Shoshana? What's happening in the home of capitalism?
Yeah, I'll add in the US, in Washington, D.C., there's this thing called the Kennedy Center, which is like a big hub for like orchestras and arts and stuff. And they got this giant bailout from the US government, and people, had said, we need to make sure that their workers are taken care of. Right after they got the bailout, they fired all their workers. So all the people that, they were supposed to help, they kind of messed with. And I'm not, I'm much more a South Park person than I am a theater person. But were I to be invited to go, or were a date to ask me to go there, I wouldn't go anymore, because that was disgusting to me. And I know that businesses are being forced to make hard choices, and I don't begrudge that. But when you get this $25 million bailout and the first thing you do is harm your workers, like that's pretty egregious. There have been plenty of cases of that, and plenty of cases of businesses trying really hard to do the right thing, even if imperfectly. But I think that gets to the point that people are going to remember this. The businesses that have acted really badly, any I've heard about, I'm surely going to remember it. And it's less about the ones that are really struggling, that are trying to figure out how to stay afloat, versus the ones who would be fine to stay afloat and are just doing the wrong thing to their workers. I know CEOs have talked about just, if you can help your workers, do it. And unfortunately, not all businesses are in that position, but this is definitely one of those vote with your feet times.
Yeah, some people, there's a couple of notes of yes, this has happened in the past, so reputation really matters. There is still a city in the UK, Liverpool, that does not buy the Sun newspaper, which I think comes up again and again. But I did also see, a note of caution from Stephen Bush of the New Statesman, who was saying people forgot about Volkswagen pretty quickly, and someone underneath went, the diesel scandal, the emission scandal, and he was like, no, the forced labor in World War II. So there's I think rehabilitation of firms happens all the time as well, and people do have somewhat short memories sometimes. But yeah, I think definitely I will certainly remember the firms that have switched to delivering at home, have been doing a good service, who've not, which ones have been good to their workers, which ones have not. And there is a case, actually, social justice warriors. Neoliberalism is social justice, is sometimes what we say. And you're actually able to apply good pressure to companies' working practices by what they do.
Some on the left seem to think that your intentions are the more important thing than what your behavior is.
Right.
So as long as you have to have been doing everything in a completely virtuous framework. It's hard for them to conceive of a situation, but of course this happens in capitalism all the time, where you do the right thing that serves the other party in exchange, but it also serves you. Companies right now who are seen to be doing the right thing, you might say that could come out of their kind of PR budget, because it's essentially a very good PR move for them, but it also has the ancillary effect of being incredibly good for the government effort and for the consumers of what they're producing.
Yes, and I would also add, there are certain companies that I'm finding the public reaction to bailouts very interesting. Some companies are getting, very much a lot of sympathy as they access government loans, crisis loans, and furlough workers, and some of them are just not. And that actually is part of the value of building reputation over a long period of time. Some of the airlines that have been upping, ticket prices, or like making you charge for your bag when they didn't used to, making you charge for have been eroding public trust and sentiment in them for years. And then are asking for a bailout suddenly at last, and they're not getting the sympathy. In France, quite a few companies are very reluctant to access government crisis loans because they think that it's going to come with strings attached at the end of this process on CEO pay, on dividend payments, and so on. So we actually saw today a lot of the luxury brands in France do a bidding war of how much they're not accessing government bailout funds. So Chanel and L'Oreal, etc., saying no, we're the good guys. We're not accepting government money at all for any of our for any of our workers. We're going to carry on paying, etc. So there's and to which they are, they're playing a reputational war as well about believing that it's 6 months, in a year's time, 2 years' time, they're expecting a more socialist state in France. They're expecting the public to be with that, and they're expecting people to be punished for having taken support in the first place, which I find very interesting. In the UK, that's not so much. I don't think people are expecting that necessarily in the US either, or even in the Nordic states. Very much not so the case.
But I do think that the government, you may find that it has to reconsider the proposals that it's made to businesses. Already you've seen that the amount of companies that want to put staff on furlough and claim the offer that the government has made is many times higher than the government anticipated, meaning that it's going to be a lot more expensive than they anticipated as well. And obviously impossible task having to come up with a massive rescue package like this with such a short space and very little in the way of precedent to go on. But they have to think very carefully about the kind of incentives they're creating, because for many employees and employers, putting your staff on 80% pay and letting them chill in their Netflix may actually be cheaper for those employees once you take away the cost of travelling to work and so on. And you may find that that sum means that businesses that could very well still be running and contributing to the economy now just grind to a halt because of the poor incentives that were created by the government.
That's absolutely true. Adam has sent in a question, and I think it's one that we do need to address. That it says, it feels like we're avoiding the topic of what would be a free market answer to the crisis that we're in. What's the free market answer to the monetary problems? What are we looking for free market solutions that to this crisis, basically? I would suggest actually a lot of what we want is from this crisis has happened because we're trying to tackle this as a public health crisis, not as an economic crisis. And actually, we covered a little bit of that last week, in which we're saying, actually, we wanted a managed shutdown in the economy for a period of time, which is something that we've never really, as economists, pushed for. But that means supporting enough companies in stasis for a period of time, and that does involve large amounts of money. Now, we should always be aware that borrowing large amounts of money is effectively deferring tax. We know that we are spending money and it's going to cost in future. It means either lower growth or it means high tax. Now, we're also walking a tightrope. Real costs are accruing. We can pretend that every company is going to be fine, but it's not. Large amounts of companies will not open in the same way that they did. Lots of companies' models have changed. We've watched lots, we're seeing online deliveries, straight customer deliveries for companies. So they're not going to be opening in the same way. We're also going to see, companies that have totally shifted their production base are going to have to reshift it back again. That includes a cost, but also, mundane things like you can shut down your church, but if you shut down your church, that doesn't stop the rain and the wind battering the roof and the windows and broken things. And and deterioration is a very real problem in a lot of businesses. It's not just about people and skills. And so the crisis, unfortunately, is like right now, yes, we need to have as many businesses shut down, to have as few people out there as possible so that we could deal with this public health crisis. But the end of it is where we have to have a relook at the tax levels, those regulations that are on government, which ones we can suspend forever, because we need to take, when we take our foot off the brake on the economy, we need to make sure that the car revs up and drives off as fast as possible to regain that growth that we've missed, and hopefully get, and if we're right, we believe that, you know, reducing costs on investment in business, reducing the amount of corporation tax, reducing national insurance payments, actually should spur the economy to the point where we pay off this crisis quicker in the long run. Don't know what you guys think about that.
Sure. Well, it's a difficult one, because I don't feel I know enough to have any idea of the kind of macro solutions in the economy that might work. But I think that it's very important that the government takes advice not just from the experts in public health and science, because if you ask the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer, their remit is in terms of health mitigation, and they will say to, you know, continue the lockdown restrictions for possibly, you know, indefinitely, or, well, by indefinitely I mean until a vaccine can be found, because until that point we won't be able to return to normal life. But I think it's important that they also take advice from their economic advisors, because lives are also bound up in the economy, and you can see it in periods of low growth, mortality increases, not to mention the nation's mental and physical health and general well-being. And of course, the implications for future generations who will be paying these tax rates in years to come. So I think it's really important that they take a careful look at areas of the economy, restrictions that could be relaxed. I think that one of the first things they should do is they should start lifting the restrictions on the sale of non-essential goods as soon as possible. They also need to relax the curbs on travelling and moving house. They should be constantly reviewing these things, and I feel confident that they will be doing that. But I think it's very important that they make the case that it's not just about life in the short term, but it's about health and well-being in the long term as well, and that lives are very much bound up with the lockdown. And then, you know, if they are able to relax those curbs as quickly as possible, then, you know, businesses could then start to come out of hibernation.
No, I totally agree with everything that's been said. I would just add just more regulatory reform and fewer barriers to entry, just because those impose unnecessary costs on businesses. And if they're not necessary, then they're costs without reason. So whether that's licensing reform or other regulatory restrictions on businesses of any kind, or just people working, getting rid of those should have already happened, but at least if it happens now, maybe it can increase economic activity. It's always hard to measure economic activity that doesn't happen. There have been a lot of attempts at licensing, especially because if you see in one state where something's licensed versus another state where it's not, even hair braiding, I can't remember the states offhand, but there's a study between two neighboring states, and one had like thousands of hair braiders and the other state had like 200. And you can tell that that state probably would have had a couple of thousand if those regulations weren't in place. So, you know, and that's just one industry, and that's one relatively small industry. Imagine other ones where we get rid of unnecessary restrictions, barriers, and licensing. So I hope that politicians take it seriously and realize that the costs need to be justified, and that you know, it's just time to get rid of those, especially now, so people can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We always tell them to do that, and then we don't really let them, you know.
I think re-implementing the regulations after the crisis is over. I think the burden of proof should change, so that it's no longer assumed that the regulation will come back in, but the producer group that is leading the charge will have to make a bloody good case for why this particular regulation should be brought back again.
Oh yeah.
I'd like regulations to operate a bit more like taxes, where we're told they're going to be temporary and then they end up sticking around for hundreds of years. It would be nice if there could be a bit of sort of payback on the regulatory side for that.
Oh, absolutely. And I've always believed that the burden of proof should be on the regulators, not the people who say they don't want the regulations. In so many cases, regulations are justified by wild things. Like in Louisiana, they justified the florist regulations by saying, well, what if there's infected dirt, whatever that means, or what if, and it's always what ifs, no evidence. And in order to regulate, you need evidence, but so often that's not the case. Shifting that burden would be a huge change.
Yeah.
True. I've got a question here from anonymous attendee. Whilst we've only got 3 minutes left, we'll jump in. Steve Davies of IEA fame has often talked, it says, about how we are currently living through a great realignment of nativists versus globalists. How does coronavirus fit into this, and will it accelerate the trend? We talked about left and right earlier. I'd love to get your thoughts on the globalists versus the nativists.
Sure. So I think, sadly, I think I share Steve's pessimism about the future for liberalism in some ways, and particularly for globalism. I think you could still make a fair case for free trade, because we see how it is, how it's adapting, how it's important to have imports and exports flowing freely between countries to get the devices and equipment that we needed. But at the same time, there's also been a kind of breakdown of multilateralism because of coronavirus. Countries have been pretty good at helping their own citizens first. It's shown that people's priorities are fundamentally within national borders. The European Union has not been very effective at marshalling its support streams. And pleasingly, I think China's attempts to conduct a bit of diplomacy by sending medical supplies, people have seen through that, and they haven't necessarily read that in the propagandistic way in which the Chinese government hoped that it would be read. So I think there's a general suspicion of multilateralism, and unfortunately, I'm not necessarily the biggest multilateralist myself, but I think that will bleed down into a general suspicion of free trade and free movement as well. And many will point to the kind of the fact that this virus originated in China, and they will say that sort of refutes the liberals' view of the kind of the end of history, that the world was just getting better and better, and that if you have a country that is capitalist, then it will gradually become a more and more democratic place as well. And I think coronavirus perhaps explodes that idea, and I think it means that we'll have to make our arguments in a less naive way, and work a lot harder at them.
From my point of view, I think there are some glimmers of hope as well from this crisis. That I think the nativists, especially in the UK, feel like they had won, especially at the end of the last election. It looks like a very easy way of saying, look, we're not citizens of nowhere, as the previous Prime Minister Theresa May put it. That we are citizens of somewhere and that we vote in that way, and so on. And it's true that people do identify with the local area, but we've also seen the benefits of global communities. Now, not just ourselves, of course. We're getting expertise from America and also some of Australia, teaching us best practice across Europe as well. We're learning the best possible ways to deal with the economics of this crisis, but we're also seeing the 10,000, actually it's now 14,000 engineers in a single Slack group, all coming up with solutions on ventilators, on CPAP machines, oxygenation machines, but also things like doctors, lawyers, accountants getting together, sharing their best practice across state lines, and ensuring that we've got expertise that only is possible by people who have and choose their local community, no matter where that is geographically. And actually, this kind of technology that has been very much accelerated by the crisis is making the world a smaller place, reducing the transaction cost of connecting, and increasing the frequency of it. And that's possibly a good thing for those of us who sit on the more globalist side of the fence. We're showing our worth in that respect. And so it is now 7 o'clock. I will let people run off and have some dinner. I will let my housemates out of their rooms and be free to make some noise again. I just want to say thank you very much, Madeleine. Thank you very much, Shoshana. And thank you, everybody who joined us this evening. Hundreds of you from a lot of different countries, and all of your questions. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.